Hi, and welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. Thanks for joining. This is Romans 9:18, and I'm excited to share with you the continuation of the lecture series in the Herman Bavinck reading group. Tonight we will be looking at session 10 and examining the person and philosophy and atheism of Enlightenment thinker Karl Marx. Karl Marx. This promises to be one of the most intense lecture series as we take a look at this most fascinating of Enlightenment figures. Thank you for joining. Okay, so my thanks to everyone for joining, and it's great to have you. Thanks again for coming. The streaming slides should be live now, and we are. I'm so grateful that you're all here, and if it's all right with you, we will open with a prayer and then with a short devotion before we get into our main topic tonight. So please join me with a prayer. O Lord, honor to you, God. May your name be lifted up and be high and exalted. May your words be revered in the highest place among men. Lord, keep us from making the mistake of equating the words of humankind with your words. Let us always keep your revelation in the most reverent place in our heart. Lord, we pray for your Spirit to come down and work with us and be with us in good ways, in clean ways, in honest and wholesome ways. Lord, thank you for this night. Thank you for my friends. Thank you for this reading group. Thank you for the chance to study these issues, God. Let me speak correctly and accurately and guide me into a truthful presentation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, and what I'd like to do just to start things off for tonight is read from Isaiah chapter 5, verses 18 to 24. And this particular reading is a very sad reading because uh, of its topical nature with tonight's topic. And we will talk more about that. But nevertheless, the Word of God does give us wisdom and good counsel in these times. And so I will read from Isaiah chapter 5, verses 18 to 24. Woe to those who draw sin along with cords of deceit and wickedness as with cart ropes. To those who say, let God hurry, let him hasten his work, so we may see it. The plan of the Holy One of Israel, let it approach, let it come into view, so that we may know it. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and champions at mixing drinks, who acquit the guilty for a bribe, but deny justice to the innocent. Therefore, as tongues of fire lick up straw, and as dry grass sinks down into the flames, so their roots will decay, and their flowers blow away like dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord Almighty and spurned the word of the Holy One of Israel. Amen. Okay.
Are you sharing a screen?
Yeah, yeah, my screen is being shared. Let's check her out here.
I'm seeing it, so it must be working.
Refresh.
Yeah, do a refresh there. Good to see you tonight, my friend. So this was a very somber passage and a very devastating one to pick but it comes in some sense very appropriately to tonight's subject and topics. So, um, welcome to the 10th session of the Herman Bavinck Reading Group. And it's great to have each of you here. And tonight's session, we will be talking about Karl Marx. And we're in the fourth quarter already of the 12 sessions. We're in session 12 now. That puts us in the fourth quarter of the series, and I can't believe how fast it's gone. I'm blown away with how fast it has been, and I want to thank each of you for your support during this, because this has just been a fabulous experience for me to get to prepare these discussions with you and to interact and engage with you. So thank you, my friends. And you know, being in the fourth quarter, we are sort of starting to tie the loose ends of the 19th century Enlightenment together. So early on in the series, we were introducing people, we were introducing themes, we were talking about the beginnings of doctrines and ways of thinking and new systems of philosophies. Well, in this fourth quarter, in some sense, in some ways, we're going to be wrapping those themes up, or at least um, interacting with how they work, how they come together in and during the life of Herman Bavinck, Dutch Reformed theologian and philosopher of the late 19th and early 20th century. So we've had a chance to see things build, and if you look at our collage here, Bavinck is, of course, the center point, but next to Bavinck, the largest portrait in our collage is that of Karl Marx, and that's who we will start to talk about tonight. And the other largest sort of individual picture there will be Nietzsche in the bottom left corner. And so between Marx and Nietzsche, we will have bracketed or bounded what the Enlightenment largely turned into. Now, of course, it's going to be an oversimplification. Of course, the Enlightenment is more than just Marx and Nietzsche. But having said that, thematically, they really are central pivot points in this era. And so we will do well to study them here. Now, I'm in a bit of a pickle, and I need to ask for your prayer and for your help. One of the points that I brought out early in the lectures was that Herman Bavinck looked at the views of the people whom he criticized in the most sort of charitable and generous way possible. And so I wish to do that as well here, even as we talk about Karl Marx. However, having said that, I'm in a pickle. I really don't know how to be charitable and generous with such a figure. And I'm not sure that I'll succeed. So please lift me up in your prayers as we get started here, because this is really, for me, a pivotal lecture, and the Enlightenment reaches a pivotal climax in Marx and what will follow as a result of the philosophies and atheistic thinking of Marx and his inheritors. So let's get started. Next slide. We have our resources. Of course, we're in Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, also the Cambridge History of 19th Century Philosophy, which we mentioned before. Tonight, I am greatly aided, and I'm almost citing verbatim. I'm almost directly quoting Norman Geisler's summary on the life of Karl Marx and the impact and relevance of Karl Marx from his essay, Geisler's essay on Marx, that is in the Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. So I want to give credit where credit is due. Geisler has really put together a very great introduction to the life and times of this very complicated Enlightenment figure. Next slide. Now, as for videos, we have 3 videos here, all of them about Karl Marx, and we are sort of going to be more focused on the person and thought of Karl Marx than perhaps we might have been with other persons in this series because of the importance. And because he's a political figure, and Bavinck very much interacted more with the philosophical side and with the theological side. If you look in the first volume in the Prolegomena of Bavinck, there's actually not a lot explicitly directed toward Marx there. However, we're going to find that the link is established, and we've built that before with some of what we've covered earlier, and we'll get into that too. So next slide. And so now here we come to it, and I'm in my pickle. You know, I've talked about being gracious and charitable, reading the best of someone, and representing them faithfully, and doing so for the Lord, for the advancement of godliness and wholesomeness. Even scoundrels, even villains, should be fairly represented, and I try to do so here. Of course, I want to offer something that seems contradictory. That is a charitable review of one of how I would categorize as one of the greatest villains of all time. And so this is very strong language. And for many who find Marx an object of esteem, this criticism might seem overdone. And yet, even as I offer these statements, I hope that people seeing this realize that there are few systems of philosophy that have had such a stark historical record of political mayhem. Very few systems have had the history that Marxism has had in the 19th century and in the 20th century, and the unmitigated bloodiness and terror associated with the implementations of these systems. And yet, despite this stark historical record, of which I cannot overly speak out against, it is that bad. And yet, today, in the world where all of us live, we are finding that his ideas are resurging and appealing to a large percentage of people. And how can this be? It doesn't even seem to make sense. Next slide. Well, let's start through. Let's look at where we are, and just give a high level overview of Marx. And we're going to be very charitable in some ways as we try to offer where he came from and what the points that he was making. And this is where we also need to consider the idea or concept of rejecting the best intentions of the statements that Marx makes versus where people took his, where others took his philosophy. And so, thinking about where he started from this idea that in observing society, in his opinion, modern work was really circumscribed by this alienation between workers and the owners, the capitalist owners of the system the workers worked. And so Marx thought that workers brought to the table this need to see themselves in the objects that they have created. That, in some sense, meaning that workers need to derive some sense of joy and satisfaction as a result of their labors, in addition to receiving their wages and their pay. And so Marx offered a critique of the poor working conditions that were quite common in his day, and the sort of unsatisfying nature of so much of modern work. And so we see in him, in a charitable sense, an expert indictment of the capitalist system. And so, from the prose, he really did identify that there was something unhealthy with the forms of capitalism in his day. Now, on the contrary side, of course, is that, by what standard is Marx making this assessment? And that's going to end up being important and relevant here. Next slide. So one of the insistences is that modern work is insecure. Workers are just replaceable. They're just expendable resources. This concept of an at-will employment where there's no long-term stability is demoralizing for workers. He also noted that in instances, workers received very low wages, while the higher ups or the leaders of the hierarchy received very high wages. And so Marx asked, why? Uh, what about the injustice here? Why should one employee make 100 or even 200 times more earnings than another employee? And so he offered this equality principle. Why should two different people receive different wages for similar work? And so this came out from him as this theme of profit as theft or exploitation, and that those who were profiting, the capitalists profiting, were stealing the fruits of the hard work of the workers. Next slide. So Marx also noted that there was an instability to capitalism itself that was really disingenuous, or what's the right phrase? In bad faith. And so the way capitalism would unfold is um, business would continue and then would come upon a crisis. So, where a market crash might occur, or some event happen, or some business condition would sour and the business venture would be in jeopardy. And so, where many people never sort of seem to put this together, Marx noticed that um, capitalism, this was really an endemic state associated with capitalist systems. So these market crashes or series of crises or challenging events were not really one-off events that just sort of magically and spontaneously happened, but rather he asserted these were crises of abundance rather than crises of shortage. These were related to overproduction. These were related to events that were not a surprise to anyone. So if a market crash occurred once and we correct and move forward, why should they continue to occur? And the answer is that capitalism is in some sense always reinventing itself, and there's never any security or stability there, and you're only as good as your last quarter. So another thing that Marx noticed was that with such an abundance of production, why aren't people generally more free to promote and pursue their leisure activities? And Marx had a question, or maybe a rejection. Why should people value work as a thing in itself? And think of here, for example, in contrast with the Protestant work ethic. And why should they make its lack such a social stigma? So why is it that if you don't have a job, or you're not employed, or you're not directly contributed to the production and economy, why should that be received negatively by the society? Now, perhaps what Marx is most famous known for is the concept that society, in his thinking, should redistribute the value of production from producers to others. But how can this occur? Well, he could only think of one scenario perhaps where this would work, and that would be as if the society as a whole insisted or stood in solidarity and we want to put in air quotes here, asks those who have the money to distribute their wealth to others. And we're going to explore this in a little more detail, because this is, of course, one of the tricky points of socialism. Next slide. And so in his mind, solidarity, or the solidarity of the workers, was sort of a code word or a code concept for a coercive or compelling political will of the have-nots to forcibly take the property and wealth from those who have it. Now, I'm trying to be charitable here because this is such an antagonistic principle to traditional Christian values as articulated in the West. But let's go back to thinking charitably here up towards Marx. In a carefully qualified sense, it becomes very difficult to understand the difference between Marxism's principle of redistribution and what traditional Judeo-Christian ethicists would label theft. And this is perhaps the most relevant sticking point. Now, Marx thought that there was something deeply inauthentic or unreal or illegitimate about capitalism, in the sense that this drive to produce forces everyone in society to put economic interests at the center of life, meaning that they are not living as they would live in an authentic fashion, absolute these economic pressures, but in fact, his indictment was that people lived in capitalist societies in a kind of economic bondage. Further, Marx wanted to include something into his role that he thought perhaps was only tangential earlier. And I was talking with my friend yesterday about this, when we were talking about when people write a dictionary, for example, and you want to put the meanings of a word in, do you want to use prescriptive language, or do you want to use descriptive language? And if you put descriptive language in your dictionary entries, you're trying to describe the way the language for those words are used. However, if you use prescriptive language, you are trying to pin the word with an idealistic value that you believe that word should have. And so Marx here characterized himself in a sort of new role and said, philosophers until now have only interpreted or described the world in various ways with their philosophies. The point, however, he makes, is to change it. And so we'll see that he is a conqueror of sorts. He wishes to impose his interpretive framework upon the world. Next slide. Okay, so he lived right in the middle portion of the 19th century. He was one of the most influential of all modern atheists. He was a product of a German Jewish family that converted to Lutheranism when he was 6, and converted in order that his family would be able to practice their vocation. Now, he was most heavily influenced by the idealism of Hegel. He studied under Hegel, and he adopted the atheism of his fellow student, who we took a look at earlier in this lecture series, Ludwig Feuerbach. And so Marx started off being with his radical activity even early in life, and was eventually expelled from France for that. And so he went to England, where he joined Friedrich Engels. While he was there, he produced the Communist Manifesto, the work he is best known for. And sort of in the light of Engels' prosperous textile business, which was a family business, Marx spent years of research and eventually produced Das Kapital, which was his philosophical economic work. Next slide. So he was a critic of religion. He was a militant atheist, and he believed that the criticism of religion is the foundation of all criticism. So he's very sharply in favor of the break with traditional pre-Enlightenment categories and thought, for, of course, they were founded so heavily on religious dogmas, which he saw as bad. And so for this criticism, Marx drew heavily upon the Feuerbach. And so the points that Feuerbach made are very much the philosophical points that Marx will make. And there were 3 sort of main principles that he borrows from Feuerbach, and that is this idea, this humanism, that man is the highest essence for man, or man is the proper study of man, as has been mentioned on here in some of the other question and answer sessions earlier. Made the great point. Man makes religion, and religion does not make man. So with a stroke, all of the old categories of thinking can be dismissed, Marx thinks, in line with Feuerbach, because religion is simply a man-made product, and it's a silly fancy that doesn't deserve to be sort of the foundational standard for all of Western society. And finally, the third principle that he borrows is this idea that Feuerbach had, that religion was this fantastic reflection in men's minds of those external forces which control their daily life. And so that's a fancy way of saying Feuerbach thought that people generated the principles of religion as a sort of coping mechanism. So there were aspects of reality that their brains and their minds could not cope with. And so these external forces pushed their limited minds into creating and fabricating these religious principles, when in fact there were no such principles there. And so you see here, God is a projection of the human imagination. Next slide. So Marx was a philosophical materialist, and this is associated with the idea that there is nothing real that is not associated with the material or with matter in a direct fashion, either being material or being sort of directly or closely linked with the material. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the following, but it's very closely related to Darwinian ideas, and sort of very much in vogue with where so much of the scientism of the 20th century is going to go. So Marx thought religion was the opiate of the masses. It was a drug. It was a high that helped people cope with the harsh realities of life, like we mentioned earlier. And there was no room in the reality for the supernatural. So it's nonsense to even speak about such things in Marx's view. Next slide. Now, Marx is in line with Darwin, of course, regarding human origins. And so this is the idea that these ideas that people have about a human mind or a human soul, this incorporeal thing, Marx saw that not as an incorporeal actual entity, rather just as a product of matter, something today we call epiphenomenalism. And so this is the idea that there really is no external mind. There is merely the material brain that is creating the projection that seems as if there is this incorporeal mind. And so Marx thought of evolution as being the controlling process that explained why things were the way they were. And so reality started out with non-living material and then moved to living material. And then eventually that living material was non-intelligent, but then moved to being intelligent living material. And Marx actually studied the Greek philosophers and found much support for his views from some of those Greek philosophers. He did his doctoral dissertation actually at the University of Jena on the materialistic philosophies of the Greek philosophers Epicurus and Democritus. And so, in Marx's view, there was no need to appeal to a god or to a creator to explain or account for why people are present in reality. Now, in addition to this, Marx rejected sort of the pure philosophy of someone like an Immanuel Kant, for example, the idea of a pure or an abstract reason that was independent, and rather Marx offered a utilitarian view. And it's this idea that what works is what is and what ought to be, and that life after death was consequently an illusion. Next slide. Now, a very sort of novel direction in our lectures here, Marx did not think merely about the abstract human being in isolation, but rather Marx thought that being human in large part was manifested in social interactions. In other words, sociology is not merely psychology. In other words, You don't just grab an isolated human being, open them up, take their pieces out like you would take apart the engine of a car, for example, to understand how the car worked. Rather, for Marx, it was this shared social behavior of the community is what defined humankind and what it meant to be human. And so, unlike sort of the historicism that we talked about in previous lectures of some Enlightenment thinkers, Marx believed in the timeless truths of human anthropology. So, for the historicists, you could not judge 16th century thinkers by 18th century thinkers' ideas because, according to the historicists, the two groups lived in completely different times. And so there were not these timeless truths, but rather they were adapted to their time. But Marx rejected that, and he believed that the human animal was the same throughout here. And it is sort of in this role of the work or vocation aspect of anthropology that Marx hinges his political theory. Next slide. And so, in his view, workers, especially the have-nots in the brutal 19th century working conditions, experienced an alienation of their labor, we mentioned before. Now, private property is a consequence of that alienation, where workers exist in capitalism only to further shareholder value or to make the bosses rich instead of personal fulfillment. There is this idea of envy. And so only, Marx proposed, in the communist society is where the individual is fulfilled. And so this is going to drive Marx's system of ethics. Next slide. Now, he was an economic determinist. And so by that we mean that just as people look in the material realm to the laws of physics to explain, for example, the position of material particles, so too, Marx thought, there were similar laws that would explain the social activities of human societies, particularly their economic consequences. So Marx was a dialectical materialist, and by that he thought of this sequence of things. He saw capitalism as the thesis, and he saw socialism as the antithesis. And the dialectical step, the synthesis of the two, he saw as communism. And so communism is to economics what the Kantian idealism was to the different domains of rationalism and empiricism. Next slide. So for Marx's vision for the future, to enact this dialectic and to bring it about in history, Marx thought that capitalism would over time become more and more unstable as inequality increased. And so the class struggle between haves and have-nots would intensify. Eventually, the have-nots would bond together and find the situation unbearable. And so they would, through solidarity, incite revolution and dictatorship. So basically, they would cease to allow the haves to have their property, to have their business, and they would revolt and they would put in a dictatorship. And ultimately, through this temporary dictatorship, eventually would emerge the dialectical step, the communist society. Now, history has been extremely unkind to such a view. Marxists have been very highly embarrassed at how these predictions have not played out. And in fact, the exact opposite of Marx's idealistic utopia has been the result in almost every situation. Next slide. Now, there were three major characteristics here associated with Marxist ethics. And so the first major characteristic was this relativism or this perspectivalism, this idea there are no moral absolutes, there are no external laws to bind human conduct. Remember our earlier ideas through Kant and Hegel and the various philosophers of the autonomous human individual. And so Marx takes this. There are no permanent principles outside of the struggle to implement communism. The only thing that matters to Marx is to implement and bring about this dialectical step of communism. Good and evil, as such, then, have no meaning except in how they help organize the socioeconomic structure and the distribution of power. In other words, it is the class struggle that generates ethics. And we see that right now, for example, in our contemporary societies, where much of the division is around race, and many activities of one racial group criticizing another is labeled as racism, but the converse, if the other group does the same thing, that is not racism. And so this is right out of Marx. The class struggle generates the ethics, and if the haves do something and it's a moral evil, it's not because it's an absolute moral evil. It's because it's an evil that is keeping, that is holding back the communist revolution and holding the workers back. And so that's why people who represent the have-nots can look at you with a straight face and say, when you do something to them, it's racism. When they do the same thing to you, it is not racism, because they have defined good and evil in such a way that it's not. Let's go to the next slide. Now, in addition to this relativism, this perspectivalism, is also a utilitarianism, and that is, whatever gets us moving towards communism is a moral good, and whatever keeps us from that is a moral evil. And so this is the famous saying, the ends justifies the means, or whatever advances the greatest good. It's okay to do things that under the traditional standards that the Christians and the sort of pre-Enlightenment traditionalism said was evil. That would be okay if those actions advance communism. And so therefore, if it moves communism forward, it's okay for the state to lie, okay to cheat, murder, etc. There is no external lawgiver to complain to or for humans to answer to. At least so say the atheistic Marxists. Next slide. So now we go to the third characteristic. In addition to relativist and utilitarian, there is a collectivism. And in collectivism, the role of the individual is minimized. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And so government shifts from the state to the people, and it morphs into something that brings about Marx's goal. And because the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, what was the famous phrase from one of the Batman movies? If you want to make an omelet, you're going to have to break a few eggs. And so this appeal to the collective outweighs individual rights. And individual rights is at the cornerstone of the traditional values of the pre-Enlightenment categories. And so this makes quote unquote sense to Marxist ethicists. Cancel culture, destroying your enemy, minimizing them, being forcing your values upon them, even as you complain about the wrongness of them forcing their values on you. And this you can get away with this as a Marxist ethicist because good and evil are what you decide and what move forward the ball towards this communist path. And so it is so applicable to what we're seeing today. And sort of now we come to an evaluation. And here's where I pray for help, because, throughout this lecture series, I have tried to be charitable, even with extreme critics of Christianity, and to sort of find the best possible statements. And I have to say that when it comes to Marx and the moral evils that Marxism has unleashed upon humankind, it's very hard to overstate just how bad Marxism has been. So assessing capitalism is non-trivial. There have undoubtedly been abuses, and Marx was right to point those out. But it's interesting that so many of the evils that he railed against in the capitalist societies were actually okay or acceptable if it advanced communism. So, for example, it was wrong for um, the capitalist hierarchy to take advantage of the workers, and yet, if if taking advantage of people will advance the ball on communism, it's an acceptable ethic here, and that right there, raises some red flags. So, Marxism has been a corrective with respect to some of capitalism's worst abuses, and while not all atheists are Marxists, yet, in a way that is sort of hard to define, there still seems to be a link associated with atheism and Marxism. There seems to be something very fundamental that links the two, um, that's really important to bring out here. Now, to be fair, even as even as we criticize Marxism and communism for um, being such a bloody system, there will be critics who argue that capitalism has killed way more people. But you know, we actually have when you actually do the counts, they're not lining up, and so we have something here that doesn't seem to be adding up, and so it's very hard to be charitable here. Next slide. Let's take off just this particular quote from Marx. Of course, in the beginning, communism cannot be affected except by means of despotic inroads, and be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. The revolution means that all of the oppression that's driving the have nots to revolt against the haves becomes a legitimate political tool when the have nots wish to overthrow the haves. And that is telling. Now, a Marxist follower from the 20th century, Che Guevara, for example, famously said, I don't need proof to execute a man. I only need proof that it's necessary to execute him. Wow, what a very different judicial system. If it advances the communist goals as the leaders see fit, then what restraint or restrictions do such leaders have? And we see here that there are no restrictions by any means necessary. These are actual stated ethics and ideals. And so we have to ask, how is this better than, for example, the Christian ideals advanced by the West with their evil, unhealthy, out of date, primitive dogmas? How is how is what Marxism brought better? Now, I'm trying hard not to sling mud here because this is not meant to be a comparison of uh, practice with practice, but I'm actually looking at the ideals. So take the ideals of Christian civilization and match those with the ideals of Marxism. And so we're not, it's fair for people to look at situations and say, oh, this particular example was an abuse of capitalism, or this particular example was an abuse of Marxism. But if you look at the actual stated ideals, you see here a big difference. So when capitalism falls into these abusive situations, it is contra its stated ideals. However, when Marxism falls into revolution, despotism, and tyranny, it's actually right in line with the goals or the stated ideals. How is that preferable or an improvement over the Christian ideals it was meant to replace? And then finally, it seems to vindicate the view of Christian orthodoxy that people are radically depraved, that they are not simply good, but are rather evil. People do not simply wish to do good, but rather prefer mayhem. It is their pleasure to act in an evil and lawless fashion, and it is not their pleasure to submit to a wholesome, clean, godly authority. Next slide. And so I really don't know how to be charitable here, because it's quite reputable to note that 100 million or more people were killed in the 19th and 20th centuries, either directly or indirectly linked to communism and the philosophical systems that Marx put forward. And so I'm really stuck. I want to find something charitable to say about Marx, and yet, we're faced with a legacy that is one of the most starkly evil legacies of anyone from history. Now, if you look at the picture here, you see Marx, the photo of Marx in the top right corner, and then you see next to him, preceding him is Hegel, and then preceding Hegel is Kant. So I want to suggest a tie-in here, and suggest that if Kant is the root of the tree of the Enlightenment and Hegel is the body of the tree, I'm going to put forward the thesis that Marx and Nietzsche are the fruit, or are the end results of where Enlightenment thinking goes. Now, I'm aware that offered in an incautious manner is not responsible, or it's not tenable. So I'm trying to actually make the cautious, responsible suggestion here. When these Enlightenment thinkers started down their path of freedom from the restraint of traditional categories, where did they think they were going, and where did they actually end up? And I think we can draw the arrow. One could read Kant and really imagine that he had a wholesome ideal in mind, even if perhaps it was misguided. And I would say even perhaps the same thing with Hegel. But by the time we get to Marx, um, this is really one of the most severe representations of humankind that we find in history. And as you can tell here, I'm struggling to find charitable ways to word the fact that this is one of the most villainous topics from one of the most villainous persons from one of the most villainous times in the history of the world. Wow. So that's our presentation here tonight. We're going to stop there and move into our questions and answers about Karl Marx.
So I have a number of questions and some comments, but I'm just going to start with some questions, and I'll maybe ask one, and then if there aren't other questions, I'll ask some of the other ones. First, though, I just kind of want to, in response to your struggle, which I think is it was a valiant struggle, a difficult struggle in the end. I don't know whether it was even possible to succeed at the struggle of trying to find the best in Karl Marx. Do you think, though, that there are alternatives to Marx, perhaps alternatives even that come from a Christian background, that successfully deal with the legitimate concerns that you noted at the very beginning about sort of how the laissez-faire capitalist economy was working that Marx was criticizing? Are there alternatives to sort of traditional libertarian capitalism that you believe, you may not hold to them necessarily, but that you believe, are at least worth looking at and worth studying?
Right. Yeah. Great question. I think there's room for us as believers to step back from capitalism as a solution to every economic ill. And I think Marx's incisive criticisms started us down this pathway. And I think here's how I would maybe sort of summarize it. One of the aspects of that period, that laissez-faire period of capitalism, or monopolies run amok, if you will, is that in situations that are not commoditized, it's not clear that capitalism is necessarily, quote unquote, the best economic endeavor. So if you have situations where you want to optimize production involving commodity goods, capitalism seems hard to beat. However, not all goods are commodity goods, and not all goods are necessarily receive free markets in a mature sense. So sometimes free trade advocates uh, mean an unrestrained form of trade that takes things in an unhealthy direction, and Marx pointed that out. The haves of uh, of the big tycoons of the 19th century, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, Vandergrifts of um, of that era, the J.P. Morgans, the Chases, all of those folks, really, in a sense, represented a gross abuse, and that was right to criticize, and we could and should learn from that. And so, somebody who wants to take capitalism at all costs, I think should be we should count that an immature view, and that there are other factors that need to be considered in spite of that. So, is that an okay answer?
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting to me. At one point, I don't know whether you meant to do this, or if it was just a slip. But at one point towards the end, you almost seem to equate Christianity and capitalism. You kind of talked about Marxism, communism versus capitalism, and then Marxism, communism versus Christianity, and sort of equated the two. And one of the things that I find interesting is that. Um, I think that equating has become fairly common in the U.S. There are a lot of people who would sort of equate market capitalism and Christianity. And I certainly I consider myself a form of capitalist. I'm not a Ayn Randian libertarian capitalist, but I definitely would put myself in the capitalist realm. But it is interesting. I think there are some, well, for example, Bavinck himself really didn't get into economics and didn't get a lot into sort of the political sphere, but of course his contemporary Abraham Kuyper did. And Kuyper had a fairly conservative view of economics, a conservative in um, not in the way that we use it here in the U.S., but kind of in the old form. Um, but the result of that was sort of, he formed that anti-revolutionary party, and the anti-revolutionary party was sort of in the forefront of creating sort of that, I think what people often call social market capitalism, that some people in the U.S. call democratic socialism, but really isn't. Um, uh, that kind of the Christian Democratic parties of Europe sort of ended up adopting um, to the right of the social democratic parties in Europe, but to the left really of where the U.S. Went with it. And then there's besides that there's also G.K. Chesterton, who you may be familiar with, Roman Catholic writer, friends with C.S. Lewis. Um, who also, created this generally conservative, in the old sense of conservative, alternative to classical liberalism, laissez-faire capitalism, um, and it's a lot of people call that distributism. And one of the interesting things there that sort of tied in with some of what you were talking about is there really becomes this fight between Chesterton and Marxists over what solidarity actually means. Because as you correctly pointed out, Marx used the term solidarity um, in a very different way than Scripture uses solidarity. Than a lot of Christian thinkers have used solidarity, and so that was sort of an interesting, um, yeah, it's sort of an interesting argument. Now it comes later. Chesterton is writing around the turn of the previous century. Um, but he's contemporary to to Lenin, certainly, and to a lot of what was going on there. that side of things. So anyway, I have some other comments or questions, but on this particular one, I'll just kind of let you respond to that.
Well, first of all, thank you for that. I actually want to take your correction, and I think it's a gentle correction, but it's an important one. It's an overstatement to associate Christianity with capitalism, just as it's an overstatement to associate atheism with Marxism. Having said that, there's something when I was reading Marx and contrasting his lifestyle with sort of the ideal of the Protestant work ethic, for example, that was so famous in America. So in America, we had our nation had this history of this Protestant work ethic that just um, encouraged this sort of all-in nature, this all-in approach to economic affairs. Um, work the garden, work your uh, work industry, work everything you can, be sort of the busy bee or the ant eater. And that's even something that comes from the scriptures that the Puritans talked about. Look to the ant, see what they're like. Don't be, uh, don't neglect the way that the ant labors mightily to increase his goods and his holdings. And you contrast that with the fact that, um, you know, I'm trying to think of a charitable way of saying it, and I can't, so I'm just going to say it. Understanding the conflict it puts me in, but Marx never thought that um, holding responsibility down and being a participant in society was for him. In the way that holding responsibility is a thing in the Christian and particularly Protestant work ethic. So so Marx lived on the largesse of his buddy, and it was actually maybe a point of pride to him that things like paying bills, um, being responsible for managing his own house, were not things that he valued. And so this is where I think such a big important source of criticism comes from, because we have, in some sense, in our nation today, a large segment of Karl Marx's, a large segment of people who've tasted the peace dividend of the post World War II era, um, and who have tasted sort of the university life and the free love and the postponing of adult responsibilities. And just like Karl Marx looked at the responsibilities of his time and rejected them, that's what a lot of people do today. They look at the American dream or the capitalist dream or the Western dream, Western civilization ideals, and it looks like a big bother that they themselves don't want to be on the hook for. And I think we have to ask why. Um, and so in the case of Marx, does it come down to his radical personal autonomy, his idea that he should be free to live his life as he wants to live? And it just so happens that that vision he has for life does not include being this insane worker worker bee or worker ant that the Protestant work ethic might have asked him to be if he was, for example, a citizen in the US. And what do we say about today's young people who've had sort of the fruits of this, who've maybe postponed a lot of what was traditionally adult responsibilities at an early age to go off to university, to postpone dealing with, sort of these hard, laborious aspects of life, and then they go off to university, they get their PhDs, they become sexually liberated, they read Nietzsche, they read Marx, and they decide, this living under somebody's rules, especially God's rules, are just not for me, and I don't want them. And then comes this sort of mid 30s crash when being the eternal student seems to lose its luster, and something has to happen, and those people need to be integrated, and they're very alienated in the way that Marx seems to have been alienated. So that was a long-winded response, and I apologize for that, but that's where I was trying to go with that distinction. But thank you for the correction there. Go ahead, Craig, you were going to say.
Yeah, I think in terms of I wouldn't make the 100% link between capitalism and any form of Christianity, though there's certainly a number of principles that do the best job of the forms that are out there. There's certainly what we might call crony capitalism today, which is, hey, we work and get special favors for us, but not for you. That's pretty significant. But some of the other elements of capitalism, I think, its core form, it's not that greed is good. It's that we're stewards with what we have. We use those and leverage capital to be more productive. We have a willing exchange, providing things that serve others, that it's free versus many of the other systems. There's this unfree exchange. We know better. We decide for you. It's not just big brotherish, it's unfree. And that's a significant problem. For most of the other systems, certainly including communism, and anything else that flows out of Marxism. I just say that as a statement. There are significant problems with what we're doing in the U.S. today. We do have quite a bit of that crony capitalism. We don't necessarily allow the moral hazard to correct behaviors. There's a choosing of what organizations are saved and which ones aren't. How rules get changed from General Motors, bailout by the government, and ownership of the government and equity investment there, to Citibank is funded and Covia is forced to sell. There's different decisions that are winners and losers that probably should not be made. Moral hazard of certain types of the economic hazard and risk that people take are reduced because we remove the consequences of some of those events by what we do. And you can think about what the central bank's doing to some extent in different areas. I'll leave that at that. That's a bigger discussion. Some good books currently that have some of the discussion that's far afield from Christian view, but I'm happy to hear any comments or discussion on that too. But I had some questions about the materialist aspects of. I guess I made a big statement without asking a question. Should I go on with the question?
Yeah,
that's
please,
a little bit
Craig.
of a rambling.
First of all, before you do that, let me just say that that is so insightful how you've put that. There really are some important complications, like the ones you've raised, that make even sort of discussing this topic. Let me see if I can restart and rephrase it. I was going to try to do this charitable presentation on Marx, and I in fact had it written down, and it was so charitable at the end that I looked it over and was like, how could somebody know that, first of all, I'm criticizing this view, and B, that it happens to be associated with one of the most bloody periods of human history ever. And I thought, if I'm going to make those points, I had to do that at the expense of overly reducing the complicating factors that you brought up. So, in other words, a mature action here would really occur at the level that you're talking about. So, it would really be bad to just be cartoonish about it. But I thought to myself, I don't want somebody to watch this lecture, and come up to me 10 years after the American Bolshevik Revolution of 2020 and say, wow, I never knew you were a Marxist. And I'd be like, what do you mean? I said, yeah, I saw your lecture on it. And wow, it was one of the best presentations in favor of Marxism I've ever seen from a Christian. And I thought there was a real fear or danger in trying to be overly charitable. So I took some reductionistic steps there. So,
But the question on the question I had is you described the philosophical materialist, Marx being a philosophical materialist. You talked about there's no supernatural. Obviously, the makings of a materialist even condemns agnosticism. I would suppose because of the lack of conviction that there not only is no God, but everything starts with matter. And you said that I think mind is the product of matter, right? It would have to be because if all there is material, mind and thought would be product of matter, an extension of matter, which of course makes no sense. That materialism would come up with a mind, and that just seems to be an escape to recover from the materialist charge. But my question really is, what is the difference between materialist and a philosophical materialist? Because they seem quite the same. I don't know what the distinction is between a materialist and a philosophical materialist.
that's a great question. And I think there are some subtleties and ambiguities here that are important to run through. So let me just do my best with it. So the first thing to answer one of your noted inconsistencies, I think you are really onto something when you note that it doesn't make sense to talk of mind and then assert a materialist view of the world that denies the non-corporeal nature of the human soul. So the materialist says that, what we call a mind is in fact just an extension of the body. And so you'll see people in that vein switch their terminology. They won't talk about the soul of a person, and they'll even stop or reduce or minimize their usage of the word mind, and they'll start to talk about the brain. And by doing that, they want to locate all of these things that we locate in an immaterial place. They want to locate that in the specific brain matter. So they want to take sort of posit as an article on faith that there is some spatial location to your consciousness and to your you-ness, and to the exclusion of a non-spatial location. But to get back to your other question about what materialism is, if you're a materialist, you've got a problem, because originally matter referred to these indivisible units of substance. So substance was the sort of ancient Greek catch-all term for describing being. And you had Greek philosophers like, I think it was Democritus, who was an atomist and first proposed the usage of the term atom. And what he meant by that was, how far can you take a piece of material and subdivide it and have the subdivisions still be that material? And so when you would pass the point at which subdivision could occur, you would have met the breakdown into the atomic level. And that's what he talked about it. And so, when we look today at matter, we look today at things that are built from a nucleus and have an electron, set of electrons, rotating around them. But in fact, we have the relationship between energy and matter. So Einstein's E equals mc squared. And so with Einstein, and we sort of had hints before this of other similar things, it turns out now that we can equivocate. Electricity, in some sense, is not material, because it's not, matter in the sense that, something composed of the elements is. And yet at the same point in time, it relates to it. And it's the same thing, too, with non-corporeal concepts like gravity. So the field of gravity, or the quantum field in physics, for example, these are non-corporeal things that yet exert a very real and existing influence on the corporeal. And so if you're a strict materialist, how can you have gravity in the first place? Because gravity is your counterexample. It's something that's non-material. Well, it's this equivocation that leads to these different kinds of materialisms. So, does that answer your question? Does that make sense?
Um, I think that's enough for now. I think I need to. I'm gonna have to listen to your lecture again. I don't want to take everyone's time on the differences. I want to be able to. I can't explain that dichotomy, which means I don't understand it well enough. There's a break between those two. So I appreciate you helping me, but I need to go a little bit farther. I'll yield to Chuck because I think he said he had a few more questions too. I have a couple more likely. How much time we have left?
Okay. Well, the great questions, and thank you for asking them. Chuck, how about from your end?
Yeah, I think not so much a question, but more just a comment. You were talking about the Marxist view of dialectical progress, right? And he kind of saw this, you know, he'd use this dialectic. You'd move to this dictatorship, and that would eventually get to this utopian society, and how that really didn't work. And I just want to, just like you've provided some sources at the beginning of your lecture, if either of you or any of you who are listening ever get the opportunity to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's In the First Circle, and you got to read the newer version of it. So when it was first published as just The First Circle, it had been he had tried to get it published in the Soviet Union, and so he'd cut some things out of it. And then after he defected, he added that back in, and the new version is called In the First Circle. But in that book, there are a number of scenes where Solzhenitsyn writes about Stalin, and Stalin having these sort of fever dreams about Marxism and the dialectic, and trying to persuade himself that what he's doing is part of this dialectic principle. And but in doing so, it's a real indictment of Marxism, and a real indictment of Stalinism as well. And it's just not written in a sort of not written as Bavinck or somebody in a nonfiction way would criticize it, but really is a real indictment of that Marxist view of dialectical progress. So I just, if any of you like to read fiction, that In the First Circle by Solzhenitsyn is really a good read, and those sections on Stalin really, I mean, they're very incisive, and they really sort of point out the folly.
I like that book recommendation, and you bringing up the point about the dialectical progress. The question I had to do with dialectical material. He was a dialectical materialist, Marx, and I think I'm having a definitional problem too, because when I think of dialectical methods or dialectical approach, isn't that I guess I always thought one of the definitions of that had to do with playing devil's advocate, looking at the other side, and yet the progress is like this battle that's occurring, and then there's the dialectical materialist, where there was the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that he was going through, and so I am afraid I have lost what that meaning is, what that means when we call him a dialectical materialist. That there's the battle, or
Yeah, great question. So, um, in the summary that I've talked from tonight, it indicates that Marx thought you had capitalism as the thesis, and then you had socialism as the antithesis. And so now the dialectical step between the two. What is the new unification of these two ununifiable how do you square the circle between the two? And Marx's answer was that communism would do what neither of those systems could do on their own, and could healthily integrate the best of both. So that's the dialectical step as I understand it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and I also just looked up a definition where it talked about this conflict, this opposing sides, just like you say. Someone plays the devil's advocate. They take an opposing position to work things out. Yeah, I think your definition and I think I'm pretty good with that. Understanding that pulled a lot of it together for me. Thanks for bearing with me, guys, as I was trying to get up to speed on a couple of these philosophical phrases and pulling it together so I could understand it.
No, it's awesome. It's a great question. And can I ask if you are perchance a musician?
No, I am not a musician.
Okay. Okay. I'm not sure then if this analogy that I've sort of used in my own thinking about the topic will be helpful or not. Um, in music, the structure of most musical works is described as tonal. And so you sort of start from this original place and you move into from this original chord or this original tone or this original pattern, you move into tension, into this building of something that needs to be resolved. And part of what makes music enjoyable is the sort of the catharsis of resolution. So a musical phrase will start, it will then develop, and it will then finally finish in a happy and satisfying way. And so good songs tend to follow these very common structures. And so that's how I actually think of the dialectical process. So think of, capitalism as the starting point, but think of how Marx points out the tension in capitalism and all of its failures, all of its faults, and all the reasons why capitalism is ultimately going to, in Marx's view, need to be abandoned. And so from there, he's going to promote this antithesis to capitalism, and then he's going to think about how it is that one can have the benefits that capitalism was trying to obtain, and yet deal with the limitations and also deal with the aspects that it failed to even address that socialism supposedly does. Um, and if that analogy fails, let me ask another one. Do you like to play the game of chess?
I used to. I don't play it much anymore, but yes.
Okay. There is an unbearable situation for most average chess players where if you move a piece into danger, where in the next turn an opponent may take that piece without, um, especially with pawns, and you sort of move your pawns into this position where you create this tension, this desire. Um, Average chess players, when they have the opportunity to take a piece, want to take, and so you sort of create this itch. And however, in scratching that itch, the good player constructs it so that you create an itch in the other person, and then when the other person tries to relieve that tension by making their move, they've unknowingly to themselves put themselves in a disadvantageous position. And so that was another sort of analogy to how I sort of see or visualize the dialectic process. So I'm 0 for 2 tonight here on trying to find helpful analogies, and I apologize for that.
No, I think I'm good on. I think I'm good on the content. I would love to hear you try a third way, maybe using football or something. But no, I think we're good.
I just wanted to follow up with some of your other discussion points that you had.
I think I'm good. Yeah. I mean, I guess one thing maybe that I would just I would suggest that well, I don't know what's the best way to put it. Um, it's maybe just a quibble um, with one very small point that I don't think was in any way a key to your lecture. But you did you referred to sort of um, some of the arguments around race that we talk about, and I would say what I would say is this. Um, you know, when you read Marx, and we've talked about this before too, Marx clearly is atheistic, and in fact, not just atheistic, but anti-theistic. Marx also is not very tolerant of even concepts like justice. Um, uh, he doesn't really believe in the idea of justice because he narrows everything down to the materialist and narrows everything down to the economic, and um, and really sort of takes that one sphere of society and makes it rule over everything. And while I'm certainly aware that in any sort of in any sort of sphere where there's been study going on, there are Marxists out there. Um, I guess what I would say is that I do think that it is um, perhaps a little unfair to some of the folks who are who it's not necessarily the critical race theorists, but a lot of the people who you sort of described as saying that, well, you're racist if you do this, but sort of the alternate isn't racist. And I think that's maybe sort of and maybe it's not. Maybe I'm reading things into those comments. A reflection a little bit of the Black Lives Matter movement, where they're you know the the folks who will sort of make the, well, hey, all lives matter argument, and then they get called racist for that. I'm not sure that that's all coming out of a Marxist framework. I think there are other things going on there. And so in fact, what I would say is this: we struggled, we really struggled to try to find a charitable way of interpreting Marx. And in the end, you made the decision that it's almost impossible to do that. And I would agree with you there, by the way. I think it is almost impossible to do that. I think where we have to maybe instead allow for a little more charity is not so much in Marxism as it is in um, folks who grab little pieces of Marx but really don't swallow him whole. And we wouldn't necessarily always agree with what those pieces they've taken from him, but I do think that there is a movement out there that I don't necessarily agree with wholeheartedly, that is sort of trying to find ways to deal with those same issues that Marx was trying to struggle with. How do you deal with the excesses of capitalism? How do you deal with um, the fact that people's labor often turns into something um, that either has very little value, or sort of in a modern um, uh, society, where a person's value almost becomes more that their work is more like a machine, and there's not sort of the traditional value to it that was held in the past. And I think they are trying to answer that solution by taking little pieces of Marx, but not taking the whole thing. And one of the things that I think that we Christians can do, and those of us who are really opposed to Marx, is to point out, as you did in today's lecture, some of the real excesses of Marx. And the quote from Che Guevara is an absolute, I mean, that really gets at some of those excesses, because I think some of the people who sort of are tempted today, that fall a little bit more in the in the socialist or the quote unquote socialist category, and who sort of unknowingly, in trendy ways, wear T-shirts with Che Guevara on them and things like that. I don't know that they really fully understand what they're dabbling with, and really just sort of exposing Marx for who he is may be one of the best ways to sort of uncover that and to prevent that, while still accepting that there are, there are some legitimate concerns out there that need to be dealt with. So, yeah, I don't know that I'm again. That's not really a question, and I've now done twice what instead of asking questions, I'm just sort of making statements here. But so I'll kind of leave it at that. But yeah.
Well, firstly, let me accept your correction there, and thank you for that. I think that's so true. There, we absolutely want to react from from a level of maturity, and you really made an interesting point that it's important to distinguish between um, people who are explicitly Marxist versus people who are influenced and sort of um, agree with Marxism to a point, but don't perhaps necessarily fully identify. That really is a big deal. Um, I don't think you have to be a Marxist to um, to point out the level of injustices that are still present today, even with some of the best peace dividends and some of the best advances um, in the last 50 years or since the post World War II timeframe is a far from perfect place. And, you know, just 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 disagreeing the evaluation doesn't make one a Marxist and doesn't make one the enemy. There are great points to be made that critics will bring up and do right, and we need to be absolutely mature when talking about that. The other thing we have to do is, I want to ask my capitalist friends, of whom I'm one, but I always want to ask my capitalist friends, you know, isn't it concerning when when a large percentage of your fellow peers say that something is really horribly broken, even if you yourself maybe don't see it that way? Shouldn't some weight be given there? Look at the French Revolution and how the aristocrats of that time maybe sort of pushed their divine right, and didn't listen. What if the aristocrats would have reformed or acted um, in a more reconciliatory fashion, um, prior to the revolution hitting that steam? Same thing with Marx and his ideas. There's, one of the worst things we can do is just dismiss Marxism as unchristian, unbiblical, and therefore we don't even need to respond to it. And I think you made that point well. All right. Wow. I could talk about this for several more hours with each of you. There's such great points brought up. Thank you for that. Any other last minute thoughts here? I know we're coming up on our 2 hour mark.
I'm really glad you had this session tonight. I'm good for the evening. Thanks for your time putting this together.
Yeah, I'd echo those thanks. I'd echo those thanks. I think that this is a really important topic, and Marx absolutely has to be, a part of the discussion here, and because certainly, whether it's the only direction or whether it's one of several natural directions that the Enlightenment goes, it really a lot has gone in that Marxist direction. So it's a really, really important discussion to have. So thanks.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Thank you for listening to this 10th session of the Herman Bavinck reading group. Wow, what a fascinating character we had in Karl Marx. I thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you again on the next episode of The Philosopher's Clearinghouse. I'm Romans 918.